Michael and Laura Peterson seemed like the perfect couple, living in a peaceful town where nothing ever seemed out of place. He was a trusted accountant, she was a beloved librarian, and together they had built a life that everyone admired. But behind closed doors, a secret affair and a deadly plan were slowly unraveling their world. When Laura disappeared, the town was shocked, but the horrifying truth they would soon uncover would shake them to their core. Michael wasn't just hiding a betrayal. He was hiding a crime that would leave everyone questioning how well they really knew the people they trusted. Michael and Laura Peterson lived in a modest two-story house on Maplewood Lane, the kind of street where people waved from their driveways and left their doors unlocked. To everyone who knew them, they were the picture of a stable, loving couple. Michael, a clean-cut, mild-mannered accountant, worked at a mid-sized financial firm downtown. Laura, with her soft voice and ever-present smile, was the town's librarian and had worked there for over a decade. They had no children, but were deeply involved in the community, volunteering at food drives, attending town meetings, and hosting neighbors during the holidays. They were known for their well-tended garden, their annual Halloween decorations, and their punctual morning walks. Their marriage, at least from the outside, appeared seamless. They shared routines and rituals, morning coffee on the porch, Sunday, pancakes, movie nights with popcorn in mismatched bowls. Friends often said they balanced each other out. Laura was warm, outgoing, and empathetic. Michael was quieter, more analytical, the kind of man who always remembered to file his taxes early and never returned a library book late. Together, they seemed to work in harmony. But inside the home, the harmony had begun to fade. It started subtly. Michael began to work longer hours, often claiming deadlines or last-minute client meetings. He stopped joining Laura on her evening walks. She started eating dinner alone, leaving a plate in the microwave for him. He no longer kissed her goodbye in the mornings or held her hand during their weekly church service. These changes were slow, almost unnoticeable at first, small cracks in what once looked like solid stone. Laura noticed, but she didn't panic. She chalked it up to stress, a midlife rut, the kind of quiet slump every marriage eventually drifts into. She tried to fix things in the only ways she knew how, leaving little notes in his briefcase, suggesting weekend getaways, making his favorite meals. But none of it seemed to land. Michael grew colder, more distracted. He would scroll through his phone at the dinner table or disappear into his home office for hours without a word. What Laura didn't know, what no one knew, was that Michael was no longer trying to fix the marriage. In his mind, he had already left. While Laura was still holding on, still believing in the life they had built, Michael had begun to pull away in deeper, more dangerous ways. And though the town still saw them as the perfect couple, the truth was far more fragile and far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Michael met Erica during a quarterly review meeting at his firm. She had only been with the company for a few weeks, but her confidence stood out. She was sharp, charismatic, and knew how to make herself heard in a room full of experienced professionals. Michael noticed her immediately, not in a way that seemed inappropriate at first, but with a quiet curiosity that grew each day. Erica laughed easily, made bold suggestions in meetings, and wasn't afraid to challenge others, including Michael. He admired her ambition. It made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, noticed. Their interactions began innocently enough. Small talk in the break room, shared jokes over spreadsheets, a mutual frustration with a tedious client. But soon, Michael found himself waiting for those moments. He'd linger by her desk, offer to stay late and help with her projects, and text her after hours under the guise of work questions. Erica didn't discourage the attention. In fact, she welcomed it. She flirted subtly at first, then more openly. She complimented Michael's taste in music, told him he didn't seem like a typical accountant, and once said she was surprised he was married. That comment stuck with him. Michael began to change. He started dressing better for work, sharper suits, a new cologne. He went to the gym more often, bought a new phone, and suddenly became protective of his messages. When he got home, he was distant, distracted. His thoughts were elsewhere, and Laura could sense it, though she didn't understand why. What Michael had convinced himself was a harmless connection quickly turned into something more. He and Erica met for drinks after work, then dinners. Eventually, it became physical. There was no guilt, at least not enough to stop him. Instead, he felt alive, invigorated by the attention and the secrecy. He began imagining a new life, one without Laura. Erica never pushed for it, but he believed she would be waiting if he ever took that step. He fantasized about leaving the small town, moving to the city, starting over. In his mind, the marriage had become a weight, something that held him back. He didn't see Laura anymore. He saw obligation, routine, and quiet disappointment. And the more time he spent with Erica, the more convinced he became that his real life was just beginning. But what Michael refused to admit, even to himself, was that this affair wasn't a solution. It was a fracture, and it was growing. Every lie, every secret meeting was a step further away from reality, and a step closer to something much darker. Laura had always trusted her instincts, and something inside her had started to shift. It wasn't just the late nights or the excuses anymore. It was the way Michael looked through her instead of at her. He had become distant, detached, like a stranger passing time in her home. At first, she tried to explain it away. Maybe work really was overwhelming. Maybe they just needed to reconnect. She considered therapy, even left a pamphlet on the kitchen table. Michael never mentioned it. But one evening while doing laundry, Laura found a crumpled receipt in his jacket pocket. It was from a hotel, too. Town's over, dated on a night Michael claimed to be working late on a client's audit. Her heart didn't leap or shatter. It simply sank. Quietly. Heavily. That was the moment she knew. The moment everything she'd been trying not to believe suddenly made sense. Laura didn't confront him right away. Instead, she began looking deeper. She checked their shared computer and discovered that Michael had recently deleted his browser history. That wasn't like him. So she dug further, quietly downloading software that recovered deleted files. What she found was worse than she imagined. Emails with a woman named Erica, late-night messages, calendar entries that aligned with the nights he was gone. The affair wasn't a passing fling. It was frequent and emotional and had been going on for months. She printed everything, screenshots, emails, even the receipt, and placed them in a manila envelope marked with the date. She wrote a brief note and tucked it inside, just in case. Then she hid the envelope in the back of her closet, behind an old box of winter scarves. She planned to confront him soon, but she needed time to think, time to figure out what came next. Michael, meanwhile, noticed a subtle change in Laura. She was quieter, more watchful. He sensed the shift but couldn't pinpoint what she knew or how much. Then, one evening when she went to her sister's for dinner, he searched the house. He found the envelope. He read every word, every line she had gathered, and in that moment, the illusion of control cracked. She hadn't just found out, she had proof. She was preparing to leave him, possibly expose him. That realization didn't bring regret. It brought something colder. Laura had taken control of the story he was trying to rewrite. And in Michael's mind, there was only one way to take it back. Michael didn't panic when he found the envelope hidden in the closet. He didn't confront Laura or plead for forgiveness. Instead, something inside him hardened. Any trace of guilt was replaced by calculation. He stared at the evidence she had collected, and in that moment he understood that his fantasy life with Erica was slipping out of reach. Laura could ruin everything: his reputation, his job, even his chance at a future outside the small, suffocating life he had built. And just like that, the idea began to form, not as a sudden impulse, but as a quiet, chilling possibility that started to take root. Over the next several days, Michael changed. He became more attentive, more helpful around the house, even affectionate in small, artificial ways. To Laura, it seemed like maybe he was trying again, that maybe the distance was closing. But in reality, Michael was studying her routines. When she left for work, how long she stayed out when she went shopping, whether she locked the doors at night. Every move she made was noted and mentally filed away. It wasn't love that drove his actions. It was strategy. He started researching, late at night, always using private browsing windows and clearing his history. But Michael wasn't as careful as he thought. His work laptop, which he sometimes brought home, had automatic backups running in the background. Investigators would later retrieve dozens of disturbing search terms. How to dispose of a body without getting caught, how long before a body smells, best way to dissolve human remains. These weren't panicked queries typed in a moment of rage. They were methodical, repeated, refined. Michael also made a series of small but deliberate purchases, spreading them out across several stores to avoid suspicion. He bought industrial-strength garbage bags from a home improvement chain. At another store, he picked up duct tape, plastic sheeting, and heavy-duty gloves. From an out-of-town hardware shop, he purchased a small handsaw, something portable, something that didn't look too suspicious on its own. Each receipt was paid in cash and discarded immediately. But surveillance footage would later piece it all together. He also bought a burner phone, using it only to communicate with Erica. He told her nothing about what he had planned, but it was clear he was growing impatient. He hinted at starting over, moving somewhere new. She believed he meant a divorce. He meant something else entirely. While Laura made plans to protect herself, Michael was making plans to erase her. Every step he took wasn't driven by emotion, but by cold, deliberate control, and with each passing day, he moved closer to executing a plan he had already accepted as necessary. The night Laura disappeared started like any other. The air was cool, with a slight breeze rustling the leaves outside their home. She had just finished her shift at the library and was looking forward to a quiet evening. Michael, who had claimed he'd be working late again, wasn't home yet. Laura went through her usual routine. She made herself a light dinner, checked her emails, and read a few chapters of a book she had borrowed for the weekend. It was a peaceful, uneventful evening, or so she thought. But Michael had other plans. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks. He knew Laura would be home, alone by 6:30 p.m. He knew she'd be distracted with her book or quietly cooking, not expecting anything unusual. Michael had spent the day preparing, double-checking his plan and his tools, making sure everything was in place. He had already driven to a remote area just outside town, scoping out possible dump sites. He had made sure there were no signs of traffic or people nearby. He knew where to go when the time came. Around 6:15 p.m., Laura sent a quick text to her sister, telling her she'd be home for the night. It would be the last text she ever sent. Michael came home at 6:30, just as she was finishing her dinner. He seemed calm, even normal. He smiled at her, made small talk about his day, and sat down at the table, as if nothing was wrong. Laura didn't suspect a thing. She was just relieved to have a quiet evening with him, trying to ignore the nagging feeling she had started to develop over the past few weeks. What Laura didn't know was that Michael had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let her stand in the way of his plans. He had thought about leaving her, but the thought of everything being exposed, the affair, the lies, was too much. He needed to control the situation. And so, when Laura stood up to clear the dishes, Michael grabbed a heavy, blunt object from the kitchen, a tool he had already chosen days earlier. With a single swift blow to the back of her head, the life she had known ended. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. Michael had planned it too well. The first blow knocked her out cold, and as she slumped to the ground, he moved quickly. The kitchen was close enough to the garage where he had prepared everything, the bags, the plastic sheeting, the gloves. He didn't hesitate. He worked with a cold efficiency, knowing that every second mattered. There was no room for mistakes. By the time the night was over, Laura was gone. The house was eerily quiet. Michael stood over the remnants of his actions, his mind already calculating the next step. It wasn't just murder. It was a meticulous act of control, one that would guarantee his future, free from the weight of his past. As he carefully cleaned up, he knew there was no turning back. He had crossed the point of no return. The days following Laura's disappearance were a blur of confusion and worry. The small town of Maplewood Lane, where life was typically slow and predictable, was suddenly thrown into a state of anxious disarray. Laura had been missing for 3 days by the time the community really started to grasp the gravity of the situation. Neighbors, friends, and family gathered in front of the Peterson house, exchanging rumors and theories. It was impossible to believe someone like Laura could simply vanish. She had been so consistent, so reliable. Michael, however, was in full control of the situation. His calmness was unsettling to those around him. He helped organize search parties and volunteered to assist the police. When the local news showed up, Michael appeared on camera, speaking with the same practiced politeness that had always defined him. He expressed concern, wiping away a tear as he spoke about the woman he had once loved. He even went so far as to make a statement pleading for her return, the words leaving his mouth without hesitation. "She wouldn't just leave," he said, voice steady, eyes moist. "Something must have happened. She's a kind, loving person. This isn't like her." But his outward calmness only seemed to heighten the suspicion around him. Investigators, who had initially focused their efforts on finding Laura, soon began to question Michael. They noted his unemotional demeanor, the precision with which he organized search efforts. While others cried, shouted, and demanded answers, Michael remained composed. He didn't seem frantic, he didn't seem worried, he seemed prepared. Over the next few days, law enforcement started to peel back the layers of Michael's carefully constructed life. They reviewed security footage from the neighborhood, but there was nothing unusual. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play, at least, not yet. It wasn't until they began to ask Michael more direct questions that the cracks started to show. When he was asked about the night Laura disappeared, he became increasingly defensive, even though his answers didn't quite add up. He claimed he was at home all night, working on a report, but couldn't provide any proof. No receipts from stores, no timestamps on emails, just vague recollections of an uneventful evening. Detectives began to scrutinize his behavior, looking for anything that seemed out of place. They interviewed coworkers who confirmed Michael had been distant for months, constantly distracted, sometimes irritable, but never openly confrontational. No one suspected violence, at least not yet. But the more they dug into Michael's background, the more they discovered. For the first time in years, the Petersons' neighbors saw Michael as something different. A husband who couldn't truly mourn, a man who appeared more concerned with his public image than his missing wife. They began to notice small inconsistencies. Why was Michael taking so many late-night walks when the search was happening during the day? Why was he always the first to arrive and last to leave at every community meeting? The town had always seen him as a dependable, straightforward man, but now they weren't so sure. Laura's disappearance had turned the town upside down, but no one knew just how much darker the truth was about to become. And Michael, despite his outward efforts to seem like the concerned husband, was sinking deeper into a web of lies he thought he could control. The more he tried to cover up the cracks, the more obvious they became. The discovery of Laura's remains sent ripples through the quiet town, but the investigation was far from over. With the body parts found in separate trash bags across 2 counties, investigators knew they had to act fast. The manner of disposal suggested not just a crime of passion, but a carefully calculated plan. Whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to ensure the body was hidden, and the town's suspicions began to turn with alarming speed toward Michael Peterson. Detectives began to focus on his movements. They knew he had been acting strange in the days following Laura's disappearance. Too composed, too willing to help with searches when others were visibly shaken. But now, they had concrete evidence to piece together. Michael had told investigators multiple times that he had no idea where Laura was, that she had simply vanished. But what he hadn't known was that the police were already looking at his phone records. They discovered that Michael had used his phone to make multiple calls during the early hours of the morning, just hours after Laura was last seen. These calls weren't to family members, friends, or anyone concerned about her well-being. No, they were to Erica, the same Erica who had been his secret lover for months. The calls themselves weren't particularly alarming on their own. They were brief, simple exchanges. But when investigators put everything together, they began to see the pattern. Michael had been planning something long before Laura's body was found. The phone calls were part of a carefully constructed alibi. He was ensuring that Erica would vouch for him should things go wrong. But even more damning was the evidence from Michael's car. During the investigation, authorities had obtained search warrants and scoured the vehicle. Inside, they found traces of blood, small but enough to confirm the worst. It was from Laura. Michael's attempt to clean the car had failed. He had tried to wash away the evidence, but he had missed something. A speck here, a stain there, a damning trail he could not erase. Still, Michael remained calm. He hadn't been caught yet, not officially, but the pieces were all falling into place, and the investigators were certain it wouldn't be long before they had enough to arrest him. The small town, once oblivious to the darkness beneath the surface, was now awake to the terror that had been hiding in plain sight. Laura's family, meanwhile, were left in devastation. They couldn't believe that someone they had trusted, someone they had considered a stable, reliable figure in their lives, could be responsible for such an unimaginable act. The thought of Laura being torn from them, not by an accident or a random tragedy, but by the hands of the person she had loved and married, it was too much to bear. As the weeks passed, Michael remained free, but the pressure was mounting. He couldn't outrun the evidence. Soon, investigators would have all the pieces they needed, and the case would move into its final horrific chapter. The question now wasn't if Michael would be arrested, but how long he could maintain his cool facade before the truth finally came crashing down. As the investigation into Laura's death deepened, the pressure on Michael Peterson intensified. It became clear that the case wasn't a simple missing persons. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, Michael remained outwardly calm, even as the walls closed in around him. He continued to go about his daily life, as if everything was normal. He maintained his routine, running errands, attending work, and even showing up to community meetings, still pretending to be the concerned husband and grieving widower. But behind closed doors, Michael was far from calm. The reality of his situation was sinking in. He had been carefully constructing his alibi for weeks, trying to stay one step ahead of the police, but now he was starting to feel the weight of his lies. The investigators were closing in, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they would have the proof they needed to arrest him. The burner phone, the blood in his car, the phone records, everything was stacking against him. In a final desperate attempt to divert suspicion, Michael reached out to Erica, the woman he had been having an affair with for months. He knew that their relationship had to be kept under wraps, but now, as the heat of the investigation intensified, he hoped she could provide him with some sort of alibi. He had convinced himself that his affair with Erica was his escape, that she would be there for him when everything fell apart. But even Erica, who had once been so eager to engage with him, was beginning to pull away. She was becoming more and more uncomfortable with the situation, especially as the police started asking questions about her involvement with Michael. Erica didn't know the full extent of what had happened to Laura, but she had suspicions. She could feel the weight of Michael's lies hanging over their relationship, and it was starting to wear on her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Michael wasn't the man he had portrayed himself to be. He had manipulated her, just as he had manipulated everyone else in his life. When investigators approached her for questioning, Erica grew fearful. She hadn't been involved in the murder, but she knew that being tied to Michael now could ruin her life. The authorities weren't blind to Erica's role in Michael's life. They started tracking her movements as well, looking for any sign that she might have been involved in the crime. But Erica, though hesitant, eventually cooperated with the police, telling them everything she knew. She admitted to the affair and shared details about Michael's increasingly erratic behavior. But she also told investigators something crucial. Michael had been planning something dark, for weeks. It was this revelation that finally tipped the balance. The police were able to link Michael to the dismemberment of his wife. Piece by piece, with the mounting physical evidence and the timeline provided by Erica's testimony, the truth was now undeniable. Michael Peterson's perfect facade had shattered. The town of Maplewood Lane, once filled with peace and routine, was now forced to confront the darkness lurking beneath the surface. And Michael, who had once seemed so unshakably normal, was about to face the consequences of his brutal actions. As the investigation progressed, Michael Peterson's world began to unravel. The facade of the perfect husband and respected member of the community could no longer withstand the weight of the growing evidence. The authorities, now armed with Erica's testimony and the damning physical evidence, finally decided it was time to make an arrest. They had pieced together the timeline of Laura's murder, traced Michael's movements through phone records, security footage, and the evidence from his car, and now they were ready to take action. Michael's arrest came swiftly. The police arrived at his house early one morning, their presence a sharp contrast to the quiet routine he had tried so hard to maintain. His heart pounded in his chest, but his outward appearance remained calm. When the officers read him his rights, Michael didn't resist. He knew this moment was coming, but part of him still couldn't quite believe it. The world he had constructed, the lies, the deceit, the affair, had caught up with him. He had crossed too many lines, and now there was no escape. The arrest was a spectacle. News crews flocked to the Peterson home, eager for a glimpse of the once respected accountant who had now become the prime suspect in his wife's brutal murder. Michael was taken into custody without incident, his face a mask of stoicism, but inside, he was beginning to crack. He didn't break down, but the calm exterior he had so carefully cultivated started to falter. As he was driven away in a police car, he looked out the window, barely acknowledging the flashing cameras and reporters shouting questions. Back at the police station, Michael was interrogated for hours. The detectives, now fully aware of his guilt, pressed him relentlessly, but Michael remained mostly silent, offering only a few half-hearted denials. He tried to cling to his story, that he had nothing to do with Laura's death, that it had been some tragic accident, that he had been trying to protect himself from false accusations. But the evidence was overwhelming. There was no denying it. The police had him trapped. As the days passed, the media frenzy surrounding Michael's arrest reached a fever pitch. The town of Maplewood Lane, once so idyllic and peaceful, was now gripped by shock and disbelief. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues who had once trusted Michael struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he had become. The person they had admired, the quiet accountant, the devoted husband, they had been wrong about him. Laura's family, who had held out hope that she would somehow return, now had to face the horrifying truth. Michael had betrayed them all. They were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, mourning not just the loss of Laura, but the betrayal of someone they had welcomed into their lives with open arms. The funeral was a quiet, somber affair. There were no grand displays or attempts at public mourning. The town had lost its innocence, and the Peterson family was left to grapple with the grief and the horror of what had transpired. As Michael sat in his holding cell awaiting trial, he still couldn't fully accept the consequences of his actions. His mind raced with thoughts of how everything had gone so wrong. He had thought he could control everything, that he could create a new life for himself with Erica, that he could escape the consequences of his lies and infidelity. But now, as he faced the reality of what he had done, there was no escaping the truth. He had taken a life, and the price would be more than he could ever have imagined. The trial would be the next stage in his unraveling, but even then, Michael wasn't fully prepared for the public outcry that would follow. The world he had built for himself was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. As Michael Peterson sat in the courtroom during his sentencing, the realization that his life had been irrevocably shattered began to sink in. For months, he had been living in a world of denial, hoping that somehow he could escape the consequences of his actions. But now, with the judge preparing to deliver the final verdict, there was no longer any room for escape. The trial was over, and his fate was sealed. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with tension. Laura's family, who had endured so much pain over the past several months, sat silently, their faces etched with sorrow and disbelief. They had trusted Michael, once considered a friend, a brother, and a confidant. But now, they had to face the fact that he was the one who had stolen their beloved Laura from them. His betrayal was beyond comprehension. Michael's defense team had exhausted every option, trying to argue that the evidence against him wasn't enough, that the crime had been a tragic accident, or even that he had been under extreme pressure from his failing marriage. But none of it worked. The cold hard facts spoke for themselves. Michael Peterson had killed Laura in a brutal, premeditated act of violence, dismembering her body with careful deliberation and attempting to cover up his crime in a way that showed a calculated lack of remorse. The prosecutor, standing tall and unwavering, reminded the court of the magnitude of the crime. Laura had been a beloved librarian, a woman with a heart full of kindness, and someone who had touched the lives of everyone in the community. She had trusted Michael, loved him, and had no idea that the man she had built her life with had been hiding a dark secret. The prosecutor's words were a sobering reminder of the brutality of Michael's actions and the irrevocable damage he had caused. As the judge spoke, outlining Michael's sentence, the weight of his future began to settle over him. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no chance for redemption, no chance to ever walk free again. The reality of the punishment finally hit him. The life he had once taken for granted, the stability, the respect, the quiet, suburban existence, was gone. He was now nothing more than a convicted murderer, a name that would forever be associated with a horrific crime. Michael's family, who had supported him throughout the investigation, now found themselves grappling with their own sense of betrayal. How could they have missed the signs? How could they have allowed someone so deceitful to remain in their midst? They had known Michael as the dependable husband and father, but now they were left to contend with the truth of his dark, hidden life. As the gavel slammed down, marking the end of the trial, Michael didn't react. He had grown numb to the world around him, his mind locked in a state of disbelief. The courtroom was filled with whispers, but Michael barely registered them. His eyes were fixed ahead, his thoughts drifting into a hollow silence.